Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel for another day of Mystery Week. I'm actually filming these all out of order. I have no idea what day I'm going to be uploading this, but regardless, I hope you're enjoying it so far anyway. Today's story is one that I feel really personally connected to, even though I'm not personally connected to it in any way. When I was about 19-20 years old, I discovered the documentary Paris is Burning for the first time, and it was just eye-opening for me. You know that I'm really passionate about LGBTQ+ rights and just equality in general. I dedicate a huge amount of my time learning about queer history, and it's just something that I feel really strongly about, and Paris is Burning was kind of the start of that for me. If you've never seen it, I strongly recommend that you do. It's on UK Netflix, I'm not sure about internationally, but you can find it on YouTube. Paris is Burning is a documentary filmed in the late 80s in New York City about ball culture, and it highlights issues around race, class, gender, sexuality in the USA. Ball culture was/is an LGBTQ+ subculture where people competed for trophies at events known as balls, and there were all kinds of different drag and performance categories that people competed in. Participants in these balls were mainly Black and Latino youth competing as part of their houses. Most gay and transgender youth were made homeless, particularly minorities, so they would become part of these houses where they were looked after by older members of the community. Drag queens, transgender women and gay men, and these houses will become their surrogate families. And it's through these houses that they would participate in these balls. So much of LGBTQ+ culture today originates from the ball scene of the 1990s, 1980s, and more specifically it originates from drag queens, transgender youth, Black and Latino culture. I feel like that's something that's not really widely known. Paris is Burning sheds light on this entire culture around these balls and features many drag queens and transgender women talking about their experiences in the balls and just in life in general. One of these is Dorian Corey. Side note, if you actually want a more in-depth video about ball culture and that aspect of LGBTQ+ history, then let me know, I'll be happy to do it. Dorian Corey was born around 1937 in Buffalo, New York, which was the first place she started doing drag. She was raised on a farm but later moved to New York City to study art at Parsons, the new school for design. Once in New York, she transitioned fully. She was a transgender woman and that's how she identified. In the 1960s, she toured as a snake dancer as part of a cabaret drag act, and she became the founder of the House of Corey, whose speciality was voguing. In case you didn't know, ball culture is actually where voguing originates from. Madonna stole voguing from LGBT culture. The House of Corey was the one to beat, and Dorian held over 50 grand prizes from these balls. As well as this, Dorian was a talented seamstress. She ran and designed her own clothing label called Corey Design, and everyone knew her for her design. She was always over the top and extravagant. She once actually wore a gold cape that covered the entire dance floor. In the later years of her life, she performed to shows at a bar in New York City called Sally's on West 43rd Street. She performed there until just a few months before her death, her health beginning to fail her. On August 29th, 1993, Dorian Corey died of AIDS-related complications at the age of just 56. In the last years of her life, her friend Lois Taylor had been taking care of her as AIDS took over. Lois was a drag queen herself, and she'd been told by Dorian, as Dorian laid on her deathbed, to take all of the costumes that she wanted from her closet and to just sell the rest of them. And Dorian had this incredible closet full of clothes. So Lois makes plans to sell the clothes that she didn't want to a Halloween show who specifically wanted all of Dorian's capes, which was the thing that she was most known for. So Dorian sadly passes away and Lois begins selling off all these costumes, inviting customers to Dorian's home on West 140th Street in Harlem. Whilst rifling through the small room that Dorian used as her closet, Lois comes across a suitcase so heavy that she couldn't move it. It was a green plaid garment bag from the 1960s, and it was so full to the brim that she didn't even bother to try and find a zip. She just took a pair of scissors and told the customer to cut straight into the bag. And as soon as the customer does so, dust and this horrible smell emanates from inside the bag. Lois said that they immediately called the police straight away without investigating any further. She wasn't taking any chances. She didn't know what was in there, but she clearly had a feeling. So when police arrived, what they found was a partially mummified body of a man wearing ragged boxer shorts and one sleeve of a t-shirt. He was tucked into a fetal position and wrapped in a layer of imitation leather and plastic bags. He'd been killed with a shot to the head. The police suspected that this body had been there anywhere from 7 months to 20 years and described it as partially mummified and partially decomposed. The body hadn't been exposed to air, wrapped in leather and plastic, which had led to it being partially mummified. But it was actually still losing quite a lot of liquid out of the body. So in a quote from the New York Times, it was just floating in its own soup. Now, it wasn't easy, obviously, to identify this body. The skin was as thin and as breakable as tissue paper, so they had to use a special solution to harden the skin and get the fingerprints. Eventually, the corpse is identified as a man called Robert Wells. What I find strange is that Dorian Corey would have known about this body in the back of her closet. She would have known that when she told Lois that she could clear out her closet and take all her clothes, that eventually Lois would find it. And yet, she never uttered a word. Perhaps it was just denial. We don't know exactly how long the body had been in there, but it was likely to have been in there a number of years. Maybe Robert Wells gets killed and Dorian, not knowing what to do, just shoves the body away and forgets about it as best she can. Maybe by the time of her death, incredibly ill with AIDS-related problems, she'd just forgotten about it. Or maybe not. Robert Wells, known as Bobby to most, was born on December 18th, 1938. His real name was Bobby Worley. Wells was just an alias. In 1963, he was arrested for raping and assaulting a woman, serving 3 years in prison. He was released in 1966 and a couple of years after goes to live with his brother in the Bronx. After about 3 months of living with his brother, Bobby disappears. But it's unlikely to have been because of Dorian at this point. According to Fred, Bobby's brother, he had an altercation with the woman next door and roughed up one of her children. This neighbour threatens to call the police and Bobby bolted, and Fred never saw his brother again. He wasn't shocked when 25 years later he gets a call saying that Bobby was dead. Alongside the mummified body in this bag, there were also a number of beer can tabs that fell out of the plastic, which would go on to be quite telling for the police, suggesting just how long the body had been in there. The rings were the detachable kind that hadn't been used since the 70s, suggesting that Robert Wells had likely died in the 70s, which was about 15 to 25 years ago. It was probably not long after he'd last seen his brother. Nobody had ever heard Dorian talk about any kind of Robert or Bobby, or mention any kind of relationship with somebody of that name. The people who saw photos of Bobby said that they didn't recognise him, they'd never seen him with Dorian. But Fred did hear Bobby talk about Dorian, or so he says. According to Fred, one night he receives a phone call from Bobby, who had dialed the wrong number, probably drunk, thinking he was talking to somebody called Dorian. Bobby was going on the phone about an argument that him and Dorian had had. According to Fred, Bobby was a pretty macho guy, and he was pretty sure that he acted out his violence on her. Lois did say that in Dorian's belongings she also found a story written on old yellowed paper. It was the story of a man who wanted the main character to have a sex change. Lois is quoted in the New York Times saying, "It said something about revenge, and revenge wound up in murder. She was writing about things like the Pearl Box Review and then about this. She said he wanted her to have a sex change, and then she wrote revenge and murder, and she put a question mark. It was like she was writing a story, honey, like Murder, She Wrote. But I don't know. The way this shit was written out, I know it clarified me." So what do we think happened here? What are the theories? There are actually rumours that Bobby may have broken into Dorian's home and that she shot him in self-defence. Not knowing what to do with the body, she hides it in the back of her closet and tries to forget. Dorian couldn't go to the police herself. She was transgender and a person of colour. It's unlikely that she would have had any trust in the police whatsoever. There were rumours of a note found that read, "This poor man broke into my home and was trying to rob me," but I could find little proof of this actually existing. It just seems to be a rumour. But it does seem likely that there was a romantic relationship between Dorian and Bobby for an unspecified amount of time. Bobby had a history of violent behaviour and sexual assault, and even his own brother said it was likely that he would have been violent with Dorian. I mean, Bobby roughed up a 7-year-old boy when he was living with Fred. He likely wouldn't have had any qualms doing that to someone he was dating as well. But Dorian was strong, both mentally and physically. She was 6'2", and it wasn't easy being transgender in the 1900s. I have no doubt that she would have stood up for herself in a situation like this. She was known to have a gun that she always kept in her apartment for her protection. Chances are that there was some kind of altercation that happened in Dorian's apartment. Maybe Bobby started to get violent with her and she ends up shooting him. She panics and wraps his body up there and then. If it had happened on the street or in a different location, it would have been incredibly difficult to transport the body back to her to cover up, especially in New York City, where there are people always on the streets. The streets are always packed. So it is incredibly likely that Bobby died in Dorian's apartment, and that means it's likely one of the two scenarios I've mentioned. Either Bobby broke into Dorian's apartment and they didn't know each other, or they did know each other and Bobby started to get violent. Or it was something else entirely. I do think it's important to note that Dorian Corey, as far as I could find, had no criminal history. She wasn't a criminal. She didn't have any altercations really with the police or with anyone. She was a pretty good, upstanding citizen. She looked after her house, she looked after her kids, and that was it. So for somebody to end up dying by her hand, the likelihood is that it was self-defense. We'll never know it for certain, but that is what everything seems to point to here. Dorian literally had a skeleton in her closet for at least 15 years, if not closer to about 25 years. Imagine having to live with that. Imagine having to live with the fact that you've murdered someone, always wondering if today is the day you're going to get caught. I understand why she wouldn't have disposed of the body though. It would have been pretty easy to do in some kind of rural area, but in a busy city with people on the streets at all time, it was probably just easier to keep this skeleton hidden away in the back of her closet, put it to the back of her mind and try to forget it existed. But we'll never know the truth about the mummy in the closet now, with both Bobby and Dorian dead, and Dorian never uttered a word to those who knew her. It's a true mystery and it's probably going to remain so forever. Like I mentioned at the beginning of this video, if you haven't done so already, then please go and watch Paris is Burning. It's on UK Netflix, or you can just find it on YouTube. It's a really heartwarming, heartbreaking documentary. And Dorian has lots of these talking head interview segments where she talks very candidly about her life, about her experiences as a person of colour, as somebody transgender, somebody part of the LGBTQ+ community in these times. And it's strange watching it back, thinking that at this time while she's talking to the camera, she's literally got a skeleton, a mummy, hidden in her closet at home. I suppose that's just the epitome of never really knowing what's going on in somebody's life. Thank you for watching. Make sure you tune in every other day this week up until Halloween at 4:30 PM for another mystery or history video. And I'll see you then. Bye guys.
Then I look, as you get older, you aim a little lower. And I just say, well, yeah, you still might make an impression. Everybody wants to leave something behind them. Some impression, some mark upon the world. And then you think you left a mark on the world if you just get through it. And a few people remember your name, then you left a mark. You don't have to bend the whole world. I think it's better to just enjoy it.